My father and stepsister demanded I let her move in with me because of a breakup, so I sold my house and moved to a new city without telling them. I, 30 female, was halfway through my morning coffee when my phone rang, my dad's name flashing across the screen. I knew better than to expect a pleasant chat. He never called just to check in. There was always a reason, and more often than not, that reason involved him demanding something. But after everything that had happened over the years, I wasn't in the mood to humor him. Still, I picked up, if only to see what favor he was about to frame as an obligation. Right away, he jumped into it, acting like this was a conversation we'd already had, and I was just being slow to catch up. He said that since I was doing well for myself, it was only fair that I take in my stepsister, Risa, 29, female. She had been going through a rough time which was conveniently never defined and needed a place to stay while she got back on her feet. I barely had time to process it before he went straight into a lecture about how family takes care of family, how he had done his duty raising me, and now it was my turn to step up. That was when I sat my coffee down because I already knew where this was going. I asked him flatly why, of all people, I was the one who had to take Risa in. He scoffed like the answer was obvious. He and his wife, his new wife, not my mother, were ready to retire. They had plans, travel, relaxation, no stress. Risa, with her financial issues and constant need for help, would only be a burden on them. So naturally, that burden should fall on me. I had to take a moment to let that sink in before I even responded. The sheer entitlement in his voice, the assumption that I would just rearrange my life for a stepsister I could barely tolerate. I asked him why Risa couldn't just get a job and figure things out herself. He got annoyed at that, saying that I didn't understand how hard things were for her after her recent breakup. That nearly made me laugh. A breakup. That was the rough time he was talking about. I had thought something serious had happened, maybe something tragic. But no, Risa had simply exhausted another man's patience, and now she needed someone new to mooch off, and my father had decided that I was the best option. I told him no, plain and simple. He wasn't expecting that. I could hear the irritation creeping into his voice as he tried to reframe it as if I hadn't understood what he was saying. He told me that I had space, that I could afford it, and that it wasn't a big deal. I told him it was a big deal to me. I reminded him that Risa and I were never close, that she had spent years making snide comments about me, putting me down, and most disgustingly trying to get too friendly with my husband, despite knowing full well that we were married. And yet, I was supposed to welcome her into my home. I was supposed to trust her under the same roof as my husband? Absolutely not. But my father wasn't interested in logic or fairness. He huffed, saying I was being selfish and holding on to grudges like a child. And then he played what he thought was his trump card. He said that if I wasn't going to take responsibility for my family, then maybe it was time for him to sell my childhood home. I laughed at how confident he sounded, how sure he was that this threat would scare me into obedience. I let him rant about it, how he would put the house on the market, how he could use that money for his retirement, how it was his house anyway, since he was the parent. He had no idea. I took a slow sip of my coffee and asked him very calmly if he was sure the house was his to sell. He brushed that off, saying, of course it was. It had been in the family for years. It was his parents' house before it became his. And now if I wasn't going to act like a good daughter, it was his right to sell it. I waited a beat before telling him the truth. He didn't own the house. He never did. The house had been left to me in my grandparents' will years ago. They had made their decision clear. He wasn't going to get it. They knew what kind of man he was. They knew what he would do if given the chance. So, they had protected me. I told him all of this and then sat back waiting for his reaction. For the first time in the conversation, he was silent. I could hear his breathing on the other end, uneven, like he was trying to process what I had just said, like he was trying to grasp how all this time the house he had treated as his own, the house he had planned to sell out from under me, was never actually his to begin with. And then the anger came. He demanded to know why no one told him. I told him it wasn't my problem. He demanded to know when this happened. I told him it didn't matter. He demanded to know why my grandparents would do something so unfair. I told him we both knew the answer to that. And then he did what he always did when things didn't go his way. He started cursing, ranting, acting as if he was owed something just because he existed. He accused me of stealing from him, of taking away his rightful inheritance, and of being an ungrateful daughter. I told him he could throw whatever tantrum he wanted, but the facts wouldn't change. The house was mine, and I had no intention of letting him or Risa use it as some kind of bargaining chip to make their lives easier. I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice now, like he realized just how much he had lost. He switched tactics, suddenly trying to sound reasonable. He said, maybe we could work something out. Maybe Risa could stay for just a little while. Maybe we could talk about compromises. I told him there was no compromise to be made. Risa wasn't moving in, and neither of them would be seeing a cent from the house. I could hear the rage bubbling up in him again, but I didn't give him the chance to say another word. I ended the call. Update 1. After hanging up on my father, I expected him to stew in his anger for a while. Maybe take a few days to come up with some new angle to manipulate me into doing what he wanted. But I had clearly underestimated just how desperate he was. Because the very next day, I woke up to a flood of messages, not just from him, but from Risa, and even a few relatives who usually stayed out of our family's mess. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. My father, upon realizing that I wasn't going to cave, had gone into full damage control. He spun a story about how I was being cruel and heartless, how I was hoarding the house just to spite him, how poor, helpless Risa had nowhere to go, and how I was being selfish beyond belief. Some relatives were more subtle, just asking if I had really refused to help family in need, and others were more aggressive, outright telling me I was a disappointment and ungrateful for everything my father had done for me. I didn't respond to any of them because at the end of the day, none of them knew the full story. None of them had watched Risa spend years flirting with my husband behind my back, pretending it was just a joke. None of them had dealt with my father constantly treating me like a backup plan, someone he could squeeze for resources when things got tough. But Risa, she had the audacity to message me directly, asking if she had personally offended me. She said she couldn't believe I would turn my back on family over something so petty. She said she knew I never really liked her, but she had hoped I would at least be decent enough to help her out in time of need. And then she threw in the real reason for her outrage. She was embarrassed. She had told people she was moving in with me. She had bragged about how lucky she was to have a stepsister who was stable and doing well enough to help. And now that I had shut that down, she was humiliated. That was when I knew for sure this had never been about survival for her. It had never been about genuine need. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't struggling to put food on the table. She just didn't want to deal with the consequences of her own choices. I ignored her messages too. But just as I was settling in to enjoy my day, thinking I had dodged the worst of it, my phone rang again. This time it was my father's wife. Now, I didn't talk to her often. We weren't close, and we both preferred it that way. She had never liked me, and I had never liked her. But for the most part, we stayed out of each other's way. So, for her to be calling me directly, I knew it had to be something serious. I picked up, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense she was about to throw my way. And she did not disappoint. She started with fake concern, saying that she was worried about the strain this was putting on the family, that she understood that I had my reasons. But maybe I wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. I asked her what bigger picture she was referring to, and that was when she slipped. She said that if I didn't do the right thing and take Risa in, it was going to make things very difficult for my father. That with his retirement plans, this whole situation was putting a lot of stress on him. And maybe I should consider that before making things worse. I almost laughed at how transparent she was being because at that moment, it was so obvious this wasn't even about Risa anymore. This was about them. They weren't pushing Risa onto me just because they wanted her to have a place to stay. They were pushing her onto me because they wanted to be rid of her themselves. They didn't want to deal with her constant need for help, her inability to hold down a job, and her refusal to take responsibility for her own life. They wanted to be free of her so that they could live their perfect little retirement fantasy without her dragging them down. And I was supposed to be their solution. I asked her plainly why she and my father didn't want Risa living with them. She hesitated just a fraction too long before saying that it wasn't about what they wanted, it was about what made sense, that since I had more space and more stability, it was just logical for me to take her in. I let out a short laugh, unable to hold it back anymore. I told her that if they were so desperate to get rid of Risa, they could find her an apartment. They could help her get on her feet. But she cut me off, snapping that they weren't made of money, that they had a retirement to think about. And there it was, the real reason behind all of this. It was never about family, never about doing what was best for Risa. It was about them and their money. I let out a slow breath and told her very calmly that I had no interest in fixing their problems, that Risa was their responsibility, not mine. And just to twist the knife, I let her know that since my father had made it so clear that he would sell the house if I didn't cooperate, I had actually been thinking about selling it myself. She practically choked on her next words. She asked me what I meant. I told her I meant exactly what I said. If my father was so eager to cash in on the house, then maybe I would do it myself. Except instead of giving him a dime, I'd use that money to move somewhere far away, somewhere he wouldn't be able to find me or expect anything from me. She tried to backpedal, suddenly switching tactics. She said that maybe they had been a little too pushy and that surely we could work something out. I told her there was nothing to work out, and then I hung up. I knew my father wouldn't let this go so easily. Update 2. And I was right, because the very next day he showed up at my house and he wasn't alone. When I opened my door and saw my father standing there, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the fact that he had brought Risa with him. She stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, glaring at me like I had personally ruined her life. I didn't let them in. My father didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He launched right into his speech, saying that this situation had gone on long enough, and he wasn't going to let me act so selfishly. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, waiting to see what ridiculous argument he was going to throw at me this time. He said he had raised me better than this, that family takes care of each other and I was acting like a stranger to my own stepsister. I told him just because he decided to marry a new woman doesn't make her daughter my family or my sister. His jaw dropped. I told him that if family took care of each other, then why was he so eager to dump Risa onto me instead of handling it himself? His face tightened, but he recovered quickly. He said that I had a house and a stable life while he and his wife were trying to enjoy their retirement. He said I was young and could handle a little inconvenience while they had done their part and deserved peace. I laughed, shaking my head. So that was it. They were done with Risa. They had put up with her for years, and now that they had the chance to be rid of her, they wanted to dump her on me like she was an old piece of furniture. Risa finally spoke up then. her voice full of resentment. She said she didn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of this. She said that I had a guest room and it wouldn't kill me to let her stay for a while. I asked her how long a while was supposed to be. She rolled her eyes and said until she figured things out. I asked her what figuring things out actually meant. She scoffed, saying that she would get a job eventually and that I didn't need to act like I was her parent. I stared at her for a long moment before asking her how that worked out last time. She bristled, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. I reminded her that she had already lived with my father rent-free, eaten his food, used his money, and never made an effort to be independent. I asked her why I should expect anything different from her now. She went red in the face and sputtered that this time was different. I asked her how. She didn't have an answer. I asked her, why should I bear a little inconvenience for a woman who flirts with my husband every chance she gets, even after being shut down every single time? Her face turned red. In fact, her entire body did. My father cut in before she could embarrass herself further, saying that this was exactly why he didn't want to argue over the details. He said the solution was simple. Risa moves in with me. I help her for a few months and everything works out. I shook my head and told him I wasn't interested in his version of a solution. He narrowed his eyes and warned me that I was being ungrateful. He said that he had let me keep the house for all these years and that he could have sold it at any time, but he chose not to because he wanted me to have it. I let out a short laugh. There it was. The real reason he had shown up at my doorstep. He wasn't here to convince me. He was here to threaten me. I told him he didn't let me keep the house. I owned it, that his name wasn't on it. Risa's mouth fell open. She turned to him, her eyes wide, and asked him if that was true. He hesitated just for a second before snapping that it didn't matter. He said this house was part of the family, that it had been his for years, and that it should still be under his control. I raised an eyebrow and asked him if he had conveniently forgotten that I inherited it from my grandparents. His face darkened. He said he thought he could trust me to do the right thing. I asked him if the right thing meant being his backup plan whenever he didn't feel like dealing with his responsibilities. I told him he could have married a woman without children. There were plenty out there. He snapped that it wasn't like that. I tilted my head and asked him what it was like then. He fumbled for a moment and then huffed and said he wasn't going to argue with me. He said I had one last chance to do the right thing, to let Risa move in, to stop being so selfish, or he would have no choice but to cut ties with me. Risa smirked like she had already won. I met his eyes and told him to go ahead. He blinked, caught off guard. I told him that if he wanted to cut ties over this, then I wasn't going to stop him. That in fact, it would actually make things a lot easier for me. He faltered, but Risa wasn't ready to give up yet. She scoffed and said that I was being dramatic and that I was choosing to ruin the family over nothing. I told her that she wasn't my family, that she had spent years treating me like a joke, like my husband was fair game, like she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. I told her that my decision wasn't just about her needing a place to stay, it was about the fact that she had never respected me, my home, or my marriage. Her smirk slipped just a little. She snapped that she was just joking about my husband. I asked her if she really thought I was stupid enough to believe that. She opened her mouth and then closed it again like she couldn't figure out what to say. My father was seething by this point, clearly realizing that I wasn't going to bend to his will. He snapped that I was going to regret this, that one day when I needed family, I was going to wish I had helped Risa. I asked if he really thought I would call Risa or him if I needed help. He looked embarrassed. I told him that I would take my chances. Then I shut the door in their faces. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, listening to them fume on the other side. Then after a few seconds, I heard them stomp away. I let out a long breath, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I had stood my ground completely, but I knew my father well enough to know he wasn't done yet. Update 3. 2 weeks after I slammed the door in my father's face, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. At first, I thought about ignoring it, but something told me to pick up. The moment I answered, a woman introduced herself as a real estate agent and asked if I had a moment to discuss the sale of my property. For a second, I just stood there confused. The sale of my property? I hadn't put my house up for sale. Not yet. I told her she must have the wrong number, but she hesitated before asking if I was my father's daughter, and that was when it clicked. I took a deep breath and asked her what exactly my father had told her. She explained, sounding a little uneasy, that he had come to her office earlier that morning, claiming to be the owner of my house. He told her that he was ready to sell, that he wanted it done as soon as possible, and that he was looking for serious buyers only. She had started the process, but when she went to pull up the property records, she had noticed his name wasn't anywhere on it. That was when she decided to call the real owner, me. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. I asked her if my father had really thought he could get away with this. She sighed and said that unfortunately some people thought they could pull stunts like this. I told her I appreciated the call and that I'd handle it, but before I could hang up, she hesitated. Then she said something that made me stop in my tracks. She said that if I was considering selling the house, she had already spoken to several interested buyers. That caught my attention. I told her I wasn't planning to sell yet, but just out of curiosity, I asked her what kind of offers were coming in. When she told me the numbers, I nearly dropped my phone. The house had gained far more value than I had realized. If I sold now, I could walk away with a significant profit, enough to start fresh somewhere else without worrying about money for a long time and a proper retirement. And just like that, an idea formed in my mind. I asked her if she'd be interested in working with me instead. She sounded intrigued and asked what I had in mind. I told her that if my father wanted the house sold so badly, then I would be happy to sell it, just not in the way he expected. She laughed and told me she would send over the paperwork immediately. My father had just dug his own grave, a grave that would make me a lot of money. By the end of the day, everything was in motion. I didn't tell anyone. Not my father, not Risa, only my husband at first. He was, of course, supportive. We have been considering moving for a long time now. I wanted to make sure everything was locked in. Update 4. 2 months later, I had multiple serious offers lined up. The agent handled everything smoothly, and before I knew it, I was sitting at a closing table signing the final documents, and just like that, the house was no longer mine. And the best part? I had already made arrangements to move. A bigger, newer home in a completely different city, one that neither my father nor Risa had any ties to. It was perfect. This agency was really good. It helped that my now sold property was in a prime location. Only once everything was finalized did I finally let my father know. I sent him a short message letting him know that if he was so desperate to have my house sold, he'd gotten his wish. And that was when all hell broke loose. Less than an hour later, my phone started blowing up. First my father, and then Risa, and then even my stepmother, who usually tried to stay out of things related to me. Each voicemail was angrier than the last. My father demanded to know what I had done. Risa shrieked that I had ruined everything. My stepmother, in the calmest voice of the three, simply said I was being extremely unfair. I ignored them all. It wasn't until my father showed up at my door again that I finally decided to address the situation. I didn't even let him inside. I stepped outside, arms crossed, and waited for him to start. He didn't waste a second before launching into a rant about how I had gone too far. He said I had no right to sell his house. I laughed at that, shaking my head. I told him he had no right to try to sell a house that didn't belong to him. He ignored that, still caught up in his outrage. He said I had betrayed him, that I had stabbed him in the back, and that I had destroyed the family. I asked him how exactly I had destroyed the family by refusing to be his backup plan. He sputtered, clearly thrown off, but quickly snapped, that he had raised me, that he had given me everything, and that I owed him. I told him that what I owed him was nothing. He went red in the face. I could tell he wasn't used to me standing up to him like this. I told him that my mother raised me and had given me everything, and even then, I owed her nothing because that is exactly what a real parent does. He was extremely embarrassed by this point. I questioned him how I owed him anything when he hadn't done much for me since the beginning, and even if he had, I would have owed him nothing. Risa, who had been waiting in the car, suddenly stormed up the driveway looking livid. She shrieked that she had been counting on that house and that I had destroyed her life. I raised an eyebrow and asked her how I had destroyed her life when she had never once tried to fix it herself. She fumed, fists clenched, before finally blurting out the thing that had been bothering her the most. She said that her boyfriend had dumped her. That caught my attention. I told her I knew that. I asked her what that had to do with me. She snarled that after everything that had happened the last time I met her boyfriend at my father's house, he realized he wanted nothing to do with her. I met him by chance. I didn't have much conversation with him. He told her that watching me stand up for myself had made him realize just how entitled and lazy she was. He said that I was the sturdy, mature, got my life together sister, and she needed to take inspiration from me. He told her to get a job and stop expecting him to pay for everything. Then he left. I blinked. I hadn't expected that. I tilted my head and told her that it sounded like her real problem wasn't me. It was the fact that she had been exposed for who she really was. Her face twisted in rage and she turned to my father, waiting for him to do something. But for the first time, he seemed to have nothing to say. He stood there, mouth tight, looking at me like he had never seen me before. Maybe he really hadn't. I looked between the two of them and then shrugged and said, I have nothing else to say to them. Then I turned around and walked inside, shutting the door behind me. This time, I knew they wouldn't be coming back because they wouldn't find me even if they tried. And honestly, that was the best feeling in the world. Update 5. A month later, my husband and I were settling into our new home, a place neither my father nor Risa had any idea existed. We had packed up, moved out, left behind everything tying us to them. No more unexpected visits, no more entitled demands, no more manipulation. I had blocked their numbers and given no forwarding address. My mother and my in-laws knew where we were, and I made sure they wouldn't tell him.